Moonrise. Chapter 2. Open Book. Jasper's head rested on my stomach as midnight neared us. The house had been particularly quiet since Edward had left a few days ago. Everyone was still upset. Even Jasper had stopped trying to lighten the mood of the house, because it would always end up like it is now. Even Rosalie missed Edward, though she didn't want to admit it. My hands ran through Jasper's hair in a repetitive motion as they lay there and looked at the ceiling. Then a vision came over me, and I was washed away from reality. A black Mercedes was rolling around the corner at high speed and coming down our long driveway. The sky was still dark, but the first few lights of dawn were visible. I squeaked as I came out of my vision and sat up in our bed, knocking Jasper off of me. He turned to me in surprise, a little confused, as I came up to him. "Edward," I said. "He's coming back," I told him happily. As soon as those 5 words came out of my mouth, our door flew open to a grinning Emmett. "Really?" he asked, as he, Rosalie, Esme, and Carlyle entered our room. I nodded, and everyone smiled. "Do you know when?" Esme asked. I looked out of the window and then turned back to them. "It was right before dawn when I saw him," I answered. The moon instantly got happier, as we all knew Edward would be back with us shortly. They all left, and it was just me and Jasper again. I rolled off our bed and walked to the closet. I quickly changed clothes and went to Jasper. "Do you think he's going to school today?" he asked me as I sat down beside him. "He's thinking about it really hard. He isn't completely sure if he will yet, but he knows he will have to eventually," I told him with a shrug of my shoulders. He nodded, and then walked up to get dressed for the day. I saw in my head that he couldn't decide from a blue or a red shirt. "Blue," I murmured, as I walked into our large closet and picked up the shirt. I walked over to him and undid the buttons of his shirt in one swift motion and pulled the fabric off of him easily. I ran my fingers down his chest for a moment and then handed him the shirt that he pulled over his head quickly. I fixed the collar and smiled up at him. He chuckled quietly and took my hand and kissed it softly. I grinned and then pulled him out of the closet and out of the door of our room. I walked into Jasper's study and sat down at his desk. A pair of reading glasses sat at the desk. I laughed, as I remember giving them to him as a joke. He read a lot, but our kind had better than perfect vision, so glasses were really unnecessary. He had put them on once, and he looked very silly. Jasper appeared behind me as I took out his laptop and turned it on. I quickly opened a document and printed out an essay that I had finished on the computer in my lecture class yesterday. It wasn't due for another week, but I was already done with it. I spun in the rolly chair and grabbed the papers off the printer. I got a clear folder, placed the essay in it, and put it on the table. Then I heard a car turn off the main road and onto our driveway. Jasper and I listened closely, and I looked out the window. It looked exactly like it had in my vision. I pulled Jasper down the hallway and down the stairs to where the rest of my family was. I heard a car door open and then slam shut, and moments later the front door opened to reveal Edward. Esme ran up to him and gave him a huge hug. "You better not do that again," she whispered as she let go of him. "Sorry," he murmured to her. Emmett and Jasper gave him bear hugs and a pat on the back. I went up and hugged him tight. "I missed you," I whispered as I pulled away slowly. He smiled at me. Everyone welcomed Edward back home and settled down for a while. Emmett and Rosalie went upstairs to get ready for school. We would be leaving in an hour or so. I looked over at Edward and saw the indecision on his face. He locked eyes with me. "We will have your back, Edward. It won't be a problem." He nodded and made his way slowly up the stairs and to his room. I turned to Jasper and smiled. "He's coming," I told him. He nodded and grasped my hand gently. "It's going to be okay," I breathed. I could feel Jasper's hand on my elbow, somewhat guiding me through the cafeteria. "Of course it is," Edward mumbled. "She isn't here yet, so she won't be downwind of us if we sit in our normal spot," I said as my eyes resurfaced. "Of course we will sit in our regular spots. Stop it, Alice. You're getting on my nerves. I will be absolutely fine," Edward said to me. I blinked once as Jasper helped me to my seat. I focused on Edward's face and nodded. "I think you're right," I murmured. "Of course I am," he mumbled. We sat there for a while, and then Jasper spoke up. "Anything new?" he asked Edward. "Nothing. She must not have said anything," he said with a shrug. We all raised our eyebrows at this. "Maybe you aren't as scary as you think you are," Emmett said with a laugh. "I bet I could have frightened her better than that," he taunted. Edward rolled his eyes. "Wonder why?" Emmett mumbled, somewhat to himself. "We've been over that. I don't know," Edward said with emphasis. "She's coming in," I murmured, and saw Edward's body go rigid. "Try to look human," I stated. "Human, you say?" Emmett said as he echoed me. He held up his fist, showing a snowball that was in his hand. He shaped it into a lumpy cube. His eyes looked at Jasper, and he grinned, but I knew what he was planning to do. He threw the ice chunk at me, and I tossed it away with a flutter of my fingers. The snow cube flew across the room and into a stone pillar, cracking it, making a loud noise. Heads turned to look at the broken ice on the floor, and then around the room to look who might have done it. Then they turned back to their tables to continue with their lunch. "Very human, Emmett," Rosalie hissed at him. "Why don't you punch through the wall while you're at it?" she growled. "It would look more impressive if you did it, baby," was his only reply. I rolled my eyes at how annoying he was, but laughed a little. Edward looked behind our table, at the table where he knew Isabella was going to be seated. I nudged him gently with my elbow. "She is going to look soon. Act human," I thought to him. All he did was clench his teeth. "Ease up, Edward. So you kill one human. It's hardly the end of the world," Emmett said. "You would know," was Edward's reply. "You've got to get over things. An eternity is a long time to wallow in guilt," Emmett laughed. Right after he said this, I threw a small ball of ice in his face. He blinked twice, surprised, then grinned. "You asked for it," he said to me. He leaned across the table and shook his snowy hair all over me and Rosalie. "Ew," Rosalie protested, as we recoiled away from him. I laughed, and everyone soon joined in. He knew by now that I had planned this, so we would look more human when Isabella looked our way. I kept laughing and held my tray up to keep the distraction going as the human girl stared. Then it was over. His attention was once again diverted to the lunch table at which she sat. I sighed and turned to Jasper. "Oh well," I whispered as I looked back in Edward's direction. I knew he was listening to their conversation, but I did not feel like tuning in to that annoying Jessica Stanley run her gossipy mouth, so I focused on other things. The lunch period ended, but Edward made no attempt to move. We all waited to see what he would do. "I think it's okay. I think you will make it through the hour," I said hesitantly, but I knew how fast a decision could change. "Why push it, Edward?" Jasper asked. "Go home. Take it slow," he said to Edward. "What's the big deal?" Emmett interjected quickly. Either he will or he won't kill her. Might as well get it over with either way, he continued. I don't want to move yet, Rosalie whined. I don't want to start over. We are almost out of high school, finally, she said. Edward's face was torn. The future moved in too many different directions for the longest until it straightened out. No, Rosalie, I think it will be okay, I told her confidently. It's firming up. I'm 93% sure that he will be fine if he goes to class, I said as I nodded to myself. Go to class, he said to us as he pushed away from the table. Then he walked away. Jasper and I walked to our class together. Both of our classes were in the mathematics wing, except he took geometry too. Will he be all right? Jasper asked me anxiously. From what I've seen so far, he will be able to handle himself for the biology hour. It is a little fuzzy, but I have his train of thought, and it's well away from hurting the girl, I told him in a low whisper, so no one would hear what I was saying. Jasper nodded and squeezed my hand. I smiled goodbye to him and walked down the hall to my class. I went to geometry class and made it right before the bell rang. I sat down and focused in on the future. Everything was fine until the last 15 minutes of class. Then everything changed. Isabella tossed her hair, just as Edward had allowed himself a small breath. The scent hit him hard. Then the vision went down an awful road. My hand shot up, and Mrs. Weber looked over at me. Is something wrong, Miss Cullen? She asked. Yes, I feel sick. Can I go to the clinic? I asked her. She nodded, and I left without a word. I walked quickly toward the science building and listened in on the conversation. Then, what I had been waiting for happened. I heard a sharp intake of breath and knew this was it. I stayed close, ready to intervene if things got out of control. But he seemed to recover from her scent after a while. I stayed there until I knew that I needed to get back to class. I took one more look into the future and smiled, knowing he would be all right. I walked back to class and took my seat. I didn't make a move to talk to Mrs. Weber because I didn't have a pass from the clinic. I sat there silently for 5 minutes, and then the bell rang. I quickly left class and went to the English building. English was boring, as usual. We were reading Shakespeare's novels for the next month. We were currently doing an essay on the differences of Romeo and Juliet versus West Side Story. I doodled in my notebook some flowers that were sitting in the center of our family table that I thought were pretty, but easily got bored of this too. Mrs. Weber saw that I wasn't paying attention and called on me. Alice, can you perhaps tell us when and where Shakespeare was born? She asked with an innocent smile on her face. Shakespeare's baptismal date was April 26, 1564. The actual date of birth is unknown because it was unimportant. He was born in the village of Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, I said aloud without hesitance. Her mouth dropped slightly, and she quickly turned back to the board. Thank you, Alice, she said to me with suppressed anger. I really wish she would give up trying to catch me by surprise. It was really annoying. One day, I might just give her the satisfaction of saying, I don't know, just to make her feel better. But then again, she may break out into a happy dance in front of the class, and that would be weird. So yeah, I think I'll stick with the I know everything charade. I looked up at the board and saw that she had spelled Warwickshire wrong, but decided against telling her, since I had already told her off once today. Why show off more than once in a single class? Then I received a vision of Emmett and Edward fussing over that human girl. Edward apparently couldn't take it, and was now sitting in his car, listening to a CD that he had. I sighed. Emmett just needs to keep his mouth shut sometimes. The bell rang, and school was out. I walked out the door, and Jasper met me in the parking lot. I took his hand in mine, as we walked to the Volvo. "How did Edward cope?" he asked me. "No one died," I told him with a smile. He chuckled. "No one died," he repeated. We walked to the car that I knew Edward would already be in. Jasper didn't know that, though, and he grinned. "Skipping again, Edward?" he asked as he laughed a little. Edward didn't reply. His eyes were planted on the rearview mirror as he looked at something or someone with interest. I turned around to see what he was looking at. I was confused, because all I saw was a junky orange-red truck that was occupied by... Oh, Bella. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and she quickly looked away from him. She backed out of the parking space, but almost ran into someone. She pulled back in, and then tried again very slowly this time. She smiled somewhat to herself as she successfully made it out of the space and out of the school parking lot. I turned back to Edward and narrowed my eyes at him. Edward actually seemed to like this human girl.